I'm delighted to be with you, whether it's in hybrid form or some of you together in the room, to talk about a truly important issue that affects us all, and one in which our church is a real leader. So I'm looking forward to our conversation today and the opportunity to hear from all of you in our conversations after my remarks. So, climate change in the Catholic Church today. I've been talking about climate change in the Catholic Church for over 15 years. And when I first started, I would very often show this clip from a film called Sun Come Up.
Solwara ini mama belum ipla em selu koti ipla. Itu solwara ko belum bagarap island dong ipla tu. Selu jemina lap sabe hamasya pihai island baising. Now ipla people look at rich people try and find him up long go stuck.
So this tells the story of islanders in the Pacific where rising sea levels are forcing them to leave their island and search for a new home. They're looking to settle on another group of island homes and try to find room for themselves among a island that's already divided and full of strife from its own civil war. And that was the face of climate change about 15 years ago. People far away facing issues that seem very distant to us here. Now, the situation has come much closer to home. Wildfires right where you are in San Diego and throughout the West are tragic daily reminders of what our planet is facing. Other crises strike around the world with daily regularity. We know that there is a tragedy facing our planet, and our young people are going to bear the brunt of it. And in response to this, we have this priceless document from Pope Francis, Laudato Si, on care for our common home. And if this lecture were to be all about Laudato Si, I could spend the full time addressing the themes on this one slide. But I'm not going to, because I want to talk more about what's happening in the US Catholic Church and some of the dynamics we're seeing. And furthermore, I know that you have had a wonderful conversation, very in-depth, with a series of speakers and sessions devoted to Laudato Si at USD. And congratulations to you for engaging in that wonderful conversation. Simply to note the highlights in the most cursory of fashions. Pope Francis treats the environmental and social crisis as one complex crisis. He lifts up a critique of the technocratic paradigm in which we give over our freedom and our ability to create a human culture to the power of technocracy, which controls far too much of our lives and exerts a massive toll upon the resources of the planet. He criticizes the maximization of profit, in which the dignity of the poor is overlooked, in which the inclusion of all falls by the wayside, and in which there's a globalization of indifference. Instead, he protests that the rich and poor have equal dignity. To build a new future, we must replace fossil fuels and engage in the bold cultural revolution this will take with resolution and determination, but also with renewal and joy. And we see this as a faith journey, a journey of ecological conversion. And what can I do is a central question for all of us. Indeed, it is a question that we must face, one that is neither secondary nor optional. So Pope Francis emphasizes throughout the encyclical that everything is interconnected. Our three levels of relationship between God, our neighbor, and the earth, and that all that we do is directed to the common good, the sum of those conditions of social life that affect all individuals and groups and allow individuals and groups to find their own fulfillment. Unfortunately, instead of a common good, we see in too many places the common bad, and the greatest of all being the climate change disaster of the overburdened atmosphere. This map shows on the top those nations that have historically contributed the most to the emissions causing climate change. And the map on the bottom shows those nations with their size distorted in proportion to the impacts of climate change that they are feeling. And this is the concept of ecological debt, in which inequity affects not only individuals, but entire countries. Furthermore, pollution and exploitation are accompanied by violence. This is the terrible cycle of violence and destruction in Nigeria, where oil companies from the global north have been extracting oil and natural gas for decades, at the very same time as there is insufficient energy for the Nigerians who live there. In fact, the vast majority of them have no access to energy. What they do experience is almost weekly floods, destroying the farming and the fisheries, and the violence from militias that have taken to blowing up the pipelines and trying to sabotage the work of the oil majors, which has created no end of strife, corruption, and further violence. This is viewed in very different ways, depending on what side you're on. According to the oil and gas report, this is the work of vandals, draining the profits out of their fields. And yet, according to the Catholic Cardinal John Onaiyekan, this is a crisis of injustice, of lack of energy access, for which we must hold oil companies accountable. We can see the impacts of fossil fuel pollution in children. Pregnant mothers exposed to the pollutants from burning fossil fuels can see the outcomes in their children in neurodevelopment, low birth weight, metabolic disorders, of course, the asthma that is so common in our urban areas, and increased cancer risks. So to all this, Pope Francis raises a theological protest. The rich and poor have equal dignity. The spirit of life dwells in every living creature, and the rights of the rich and poor must be guaranteed. This is fundamentally rooted in the doctrine of creation. Creation is of the order of love. God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things, for you love all things that exist. They come to being from God's love. They are sustained by God's love and brought to salvation by God's love. And this beautiful creation is a sacramental testament to that. So Laudato Si represents an ecological high mark in the tradition of Catholic social teaching, which we can view as having three waves since its beginnings at the end of the 20th century. I beg your pardon, the 19th century. Those themes primarily involved the industrial age and the worker, and then turn to focus on just and integral development. And with some of the final documents from Pope John Paul II and Benedict, we see concerns about the environment, but it's not to Laudato Si that we have an entire encyclical devoted entirely to the environment and the intertwined social crises. All of these documents reflect the core principles of Catholic teaching, which are the dignity of the human person, a call to family, community, and participation, rights and responsibilities, the option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and of course, care for God's creation. These documents reflect deep theological sources in our Catholic intellectual tradition, beginning, of course, with scripture, with the profound inspiration of Saint Francis and other saints and other early Catholic theologians. A wonderful early text is the 1990 World Day of Peace message from St. John Paul II. It's a beautiful statement of environmental responsibility, now 30 years old. Benedict XVI's Caritas in Veritate has some very trenchant reflections on technology and contemplation and care for creation. In the United States, the US bishops have written a plea for prudence and the common good. And before both the Lima and the Paris UN conferences, the global bishops wrote very strong appeals for 100% renewable energy futures to be presented at those conferences. And then, of course, there are the thousands and thousands of theological and ethical writings that take up the question of religion and ecology and environmental theology. So let's take a look at one of those documents, Global Climate Change, a plea for dialogue, prudence, and the common good, a statement from the US bishops from 2001. It's a very short document. It's very readable. It makes all the important points that you would want to see. It's a very good document. And I was struck by this statement. Since our country's involvement is key to any resolution of these concerns, we call on our people and government to recognize the seriousness of the global warming threat. This is 20 years ago. We encourage citizens to become informed participants in this important public debate. There's no question, awareness, being informed is essential for action. Without an informed conscience, no one can take action. And so to educate on climate change and allow citizens to become informed participants is truly crucial. Yet, it seems that there has been silence from the US bishops in their own dioceses. It's almost like a New Year's resolution, something you really intend to do, but somehow it hasn't happened. 96% of the 178 dioceses in the US have a publication of some kind, online or regular newsprint. Scholars have analyzed over 12,000 bishops' columns in a 5-year period, just before the publication of Laudato Si up until 2019, searching for every mention of climate and warming and global warming, global climate change, etc. This analysis yielded a total of 93 columns that discuss climate change. So, despite the stated intention to recognize the importance of an informed citizenry, this is not an issue about which the bishops are writing and informing their flocks about in the United States. We are not hearing about it from our bishops, and most of us aren't hearing about it from our priests either. Probably because so many priests take take a cue from their own bishops about what are the priorities. Let's put that in the context of the greater US Catholic response to Laudato Si. Overall, there is a very positive response to Francis on the question of global warming. Studies show that 72% of Catholics trust Francis for information on global warming, and 35% of Catholics say the Pope's position on global warming has influenced their views. Half of those say the Pope has made them more concerned about global warming. Yet there's an interesting eddy, an interesting backcurrent in this tide of generally positive response. And that, interestingly enough, pertains to the views of the most regular Mass goers. These people, according to research by the Center on the Apostolate at Georgetown, are the most likely to see little conflict between their faith and science. However, they are the least likely to say that climate change is a very important problem. And they are also the least likely to agree they have a moral responsibility to respond to climate change. More research would have to be done, and it's hard to tease out correlation from causation. But we might wonder if it is in fact those who are such dedicated churchgoers and receive their moral messaging so faithfully from their position in the pews that they are not hearing about climate change from their priests, reinforced by their bishops. And perhaps that's why this group is least likely to feel they have a moral responsibility to respond to climate change. There are multiple factors here as well. Traditional persons tend to be the most regular Mass goers, and conservatives do often dismiss environmentalist warnings. This can be for multiple reasons. Often, as we know, political identification correlates strongly with environmental concerns. Very often, political conservatives have views against some of the solutions associated with climate change that they feel are counter to market solutions. Fortunately, we're seeing so many changes in this way of thinking with carbon pricing, et cetera. And there's also ways in which the rhetoric of crisis is failing to reach many people in this group. This rhetoric of crisis, the doom and gloom narrative, instead sparks a backlash, feeling that they're being deliberately manipulated. It goes along with the mistrust of media and a sense that fears and concerns are being inflated on purpose to alarm them. So we need to move past this dialogue that creates more caricature than common ground. We need to emphasize the religious shared values of honoring God the Creator and caring for God's creation for the good of everyone, and move this out of the realm of partisan politics. It's essential to overcome the chasm of partisanship because, as one important Catholic eco-blogger, Bill Patenaude, has asked, can half the church take on the mission of the whole church? He puts the question pretty starkly, recognizing that by and large, it has mostly been the more left-leaning side of the church that has taken on the environmental crisis, leaving this critical problem abandoned or distasteful to the other half of our church. And we are one church and we are one family living on one planet. We must take this mission on together. So we have to overcome these gaps and recognize, however, that these gaps do not exist just in the church. Around our church, around society, we find that Less is done than we would like, even with knowledge and awareness. So the research that I've done that is in my book, Inspired Sustainability, looks at how people are inspired to take action and what holds them back from taking action. What exactly are the gaps? Aside from this question of moral messaging from our pastoral leadership in the church. And what I found, talking not only to Catholics, not only to Christians, but to faith-based environmentalists around the country, is that there are 7 major motivators. First is a strong sense of scientific literacy. This is really critical, and it goes to how important the bishop's insight is that we must have an informed citizenry. If we're not concerned, if we're not aware that there's a problem, why would it make sense to do anything about it? Second of all of the faith-based environmentalists had a very strong sense of interdependence, exactly the theme that rings so continually throughout Laudato Si. They were also committed to social justice. And because of their awareness of spiritual interdependence, social, economic, even chemical and ecological interdependence, it was easy for them to connect the dots and see that people would be suffering as a result of the impacts of climate change that connected to their own behaviors. And this motivated them to take action. They also were aware of a bigger God, that God cared not just for human souls, but for an expanding family of life and an expanding moral universe, even unto the cosmos. They felt, of course, a reverence for creation. Many of them had a strong sense of interfaith connections and worked in partnership with others in coalitions. And many of them were independent thinkers. They valued their congregations for shared values, for shared traditions, but at the same time, they really enjoyed having a place to talk over new ideas. And I think this empowered them as well to become leaders in the space of faith-based environmentalism and care for creation. In terms of the gaps, talking with all these people in a series of focus groups enabled me to identify 3 gaps. The knowledge gap. I'm not convinced or I'm not concerned. This gap is fading as the facts become all the more clear and it's becoming harder to hide. Secondly is the caring gap. I know about climate change, but I'm conflicted. I have other problems. I have other things to care about. Thirdly, the action gap. I care, but what exactly can I do? So the knowledge gap certainly embeds scientific literacy limitations, cognitive limitations, the way our psychology is framed by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to respond to instant crises and not problems out in the apparently distant future. It relates to personal inclination, the hobbies of a gardener as opposed to the hobbies of a model airplane builder. One gets you out in nature, one doesn't. And willful ignorance as a moral limit to knowledge, because willful ignorance protects us from the necessary consequence of having to do something about what we know. And it's painful. We're realizing more and more the pain of climate grief. And in fact, climate therapists are developing a whole new subfield. So it's important to respond to these limitations and use neutral language. People react so differently to the words carbon tax or carbon offset. We have to be aware of how political filters keep out the information people are willing to accept and draw instead on our core values of care for the poor, of care for the marginalized, of making the abundance of God's creation available to all. People have a resistance to long-term thinking, so it's essential to highlight the long view. the long view of our children, our grandchildren, not just next month's quarterly earnings. And we have to inform without overwhelming. There's a finite pool of worry. There's only so much people can worry about. And it's really important to be compassionate about this, especially in a time like now during the pandemic, where people have so many worries. How can we compassionately enable them to embrace concern for this problem and integrate it into what they do? Conveying relevant solutions that are positive is an excellent way to do this. The caring gap, which says, I know, but I'm conflicted, reflects the power of consumerism, a desire to keep in step with progress, the distractions of our daily lives, and the fact of sheer indifference. You know, so many of us are bombarded with invitations to consumerist indulgence in our emails, which some of my focus group participants described as an onslaught, a seduction. It never ended. We see in this fantastic comic strip, the words of the prophet have been converted into an invitation to attend yet another sale. And the action gap speaks to all the things that keep us from taking action, even when we really do want to do something. We're all busy. This is true. We're legitimately busy taking care of necessary obligations. Now, sometimes we're too comfortable. Some of my participants said, are we maybe lazy? We can be habituated to negative habits of consumption, habits of diet, habits of travel, even addicted to these habits, and of course, overwhelmed. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed when we feel that changing the problem of climate change, reversing this massive course that we're on, is up to us. It's as if we individually, through our lifestyle changes, have to grab the prow of the Titanic and pull it around. This is impossible. And it's not up to us as individuals. It's the system that needs to change, and we have to find ways to challenge and bring in new structures for our future society, a bold cultural revolution, as Pope Francis says. So we need to communicate positively. And these are the titles from the blog that I mentioned by Bill Papanog, who asked, can half the church carry the mission of the whole church? And he urges us to have those conversations with conservatives and to be open to leaning from the left, depending on where we're coming from, because we are one church and we need to talk, respect each other's opinions, and find a way forward. There are signs of hope. I hope everyone recognizes this amazing young woman, Greta Thunberg, who inspired thousands with her refusal to go to school anymore on Fridays and to wait for her Swedish parliament to take action on climate change, because what's the point of going to school to prepare for a future that is going to be compromised by the degradations we see? And hope comes in the amazing changes that are happening in our energy system. This 10-year analysis shows how powerfully the costs of renewable energy have changed. Utility scale solar is the most affordable energy system. This is the Lazard levelized cost comparison. It's the industry standard cost comparison. This is not rooftop solar. Rooftop solar remains one of the most expensive, but utility scale solar is dramatically more affordable. And nuclear is at the top with coal right below it. Nuclear is a very complicated question. Coal is a disaster. There should be absolutely no coal burned anywhere in the world ever again. More great news, amazing news. This report that came out recently from the International Energy Agency, a a multinational think tank, so to speak, representing oil-producing countries, calls for no new fossil fuels. For years, the International Energy Agency has been putting out annual reports that very conservatively express the world's energy needs as basically those of the year before, without taking into account the changes and the transformation to renewable energy economy we all know we need. But this year, somehow the light went on and they published this report saying that no new fossil fuels should be extracted in order to meet a safe target and net zero emissions by 2050. And this report contains a detailed pathway of how the world's economies can reach that goal with specific strategies and plans. So it's an extraordinary document. Our solutions are not just technical and scientific and economic. Clearly, this is a moral issue that calls us to solidarity with developing nations. And Laudato Si is very clear that we must stand in solidarity with developing nations. While there is an overall need to transform our energy system, as paragraph 26 says, there is an urgent need to develop policies to limit emissions and substitute for fossil fuels. This is the task primarily of the developed nations, those with the inflated presence on the map showing their historic contribution to the problem. The developed countries ought to help pay their ecological debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy. That will leave whatever remains in our carbon budget of liquid fuels, the easy to use gas and oil, to the developing nations, because it is only just that they have the chance to catch up and use those fuels while the advanced nations develop the most complex and capital intensive energy technologies. It's our job to develop the more complex solar systems, wind systems, et cetera, battery solutions, so that they can be developed, commercialized, and lower in cost. And then those technologies given to developing nations as well. So this involves a moral act of solidarity along with simply developing the tools. They have to be used justly. So what should consumers do? Well, purchase renewable energy through your own home utility. It's an option for many. Of course, lifestyle changes are important. They make a difference. And from a faith perspective, they develop the virtuous habit, which reinforces our love of doing the right thing and our sense of commitment to ecological conversion. As citizens, we need to write our congresspeople, support the Paris Accord, support the Green Climate Fund, which enables new technologies to be transferred to developing nations. And we need to support a carbon price, and it's moving ahead in Congress right now. One of the most important things that people need to do is talk about climate change, because studies show that most people never have conversations about climate change. It's almost a taboo subject, and yet it is the most pressing ethical crisis facing us today. So be courageous, mention it, have a conversation about climate change, allow it to be something that we talk about, and do so in a spirit of listening and bridging our divides. Investors need to accelerate investments in renewable energy and create the fossil fuel options, because we have to stop investing in the expansion of fossil fuels. This cartoon is too close to the mark, really, to be funny. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. In fact, I look upon divestment as a sacramental action. Many ask if it's risky and ineffective. By contrast, it's a pragmatic funding of new, clean, healthy, renewable energy sources. It is symbolic in the sense that it's a symbol of discipleship and commitment. And it's a real symbol as a real gift of the energy that people need that is life-giving. It's just as much a gift of life as the gift of bread. And so I view it as a sacramental action. This message is so important on college campuses because here we have the power of young people to tap into. Young people are concerned about climate change. An American Conservation Coalition found that young people have concerns regardless of their position on the political spectrum. 90% believe the US should invest in clean energy. That's huge. And Republicans are using this as a strategy to remind themselves to put clean energy in their political platforms. Then we have the power of the Friday strikers, the hundreds of thousands that Greta has mobilized to march around the world, striking on Fridays to protest petrocapitalism. So we have the opportunity now in the United States to speak to a listening church. We are entering a time of the synod. There is supposed to be a synodal listening process underway. And to me, this suggests an opportunity to email all of our pastors or speak to them after Mass and say, what is the process for passing on our views in the synodal listening process? Because I would like to share my concerns about climate, and I would like to see more action from the church. Here we have a picture of Cardinal Hollerich, who is the president of the European Bishops' Conference, and he had some interesting words on listening in a recent webinar hosted by the Laudato Si movement.
I think many bishops are very happy when people come up to them and speak with them, because the big danger of being a bishop is that if you do not do an effort, you live in a world of administration, of different councils, and you live in a clerical world. And you can help your bishop to get out of that, to be in touch with reality. And nothing is more real than climate change. And you can still tell your bishop that God is present in reality, much more than in our dreams. So it's a chance for the church.
So this
Thank
was
you,
an
Cardinal Hollerich. And
invitation.
indeed, we've seen the great examples coming up from Claire and
This was an invitation that Bishop Hollerich issued, particularly to young people, to reach out to their bishops as to a grandfather, to a listening grandfather, and share their concerns about climate change. And I hope that, that all of us will do so. Laudato Si certainly has had an impact around the world. All the world's religions reacted with rejoicing to hear this leadership from someone of the moral authority of the Pope. There were statements issued by Muslim leaders, Jewish leaders, Indian leaders, the Dalai Lama, interfaith leaders. It was widely received as an influential document, and indeed by secular leaders at the UN and at the climate change conferences. So it's so important that we continue to raise our voices to those contexts. And one thing we can all do now is participate in a petition that the Laudato Si movement is hosting to gather as many signatures as possible and bring them to the United Nations gatherings, which are happening this fall. COP15 and COP26. So if everyone at this moment can take out their phone or put a new browser window onto their computer, go to healthypeoplehealthyplanet.org or the catholicpetition.org and sign the petition. This enables us to bring a loud voice showing that Catholics want climate action at the COPs. And this is something that we know has influence because at the Paris Accords, the work of Pope Francis was widely recognized to be influential. And Pope Francis is going to Glasgow again for this year's UN conferences. So please do participate in this. We all need to raise our voices. This is action that we can see increasingly coming from our church. The Vatican's Laudato Si action plan will be unrolled throughout our dioceses, and it's very exciting to see it. And it's something that we're all called to be a part of. It's a pathway, as I said, that is meant to be one of gratitude and joy. Despite our worries, despite our concerns, we have to take the larger vision of being part of God's providence, knowing that God is present to each being and creation is truly ongoing. The message of Laudato Si is that Christ is present to every being, surrounding and blessing it, and that we are invited to be grateful for God's loving gift of creation and grateful for ourselves who are part of it, who are brothers and sisters with all in it, and who have a special responsibility to care for it. So I offer some final questions for reflection to this community, and I'm so grateful to have had the time to speak with you here today, and I look forward to comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lothes, for a very enlightening presentation. I'm glad you kept it upbeat because this topic can get you very depressed as we get into it. We have some live members here. Anybody in the live audience community would like to ask a question, just let me know and you can come up and ask your question here. If you are in our Zoom community, feel free to send a question through the chat and we'll unmute you and allow you to ask your question that way. And so, Dr. Lothes, if you could stop sharing your screen, we could, okay. So let me just start with the question. You have the 2050 report, very positive, but do we have to 2050?
Well, we need immediate action in the next decade that drastically cuts emissions, but we will have, obviously, with any hope, a planet that we're still inhabiting in 2031. And so actions and plans are needed thereafter. We can do the most drastic scaling up of renewable energies with the current technologies now, but we do have to continue to plan for new technologies that are not yet ready and may be an important part of our future energy plan. So do we have until 2050? First of all, I think we as Christians fundamentally look upon God as creator and God who will always stand by and validate the creation. And it's our job to take radical action, but to live in hope. So yes, we will be here in 2050. But you're absolutely right. This is the decade of intense radical action. We need to shut down the fossil fuel expansion immediately, and we need to ramp backwards the existing fossil fuel structures as fast as possible and faster.
Dick and Jeff, you're muted.
I'm sorry, Jeff, if you were speaking, I didn't hear it. I think
Okay,
you're
sorry
on.
about that. So I had the question about if, you talked about the systemic change is really the essential part of getting this under control, but at the same time advocating lifestyle changes. Is that more, you also mentioned the sort of habits and virtues that's associated with that. Is that more important than actual impact that lifestyle change makes?
Do you mean our habits? Is the virtue more important than the impact of the lifestyle?
Right, that our lifestyle changes aren't really going to make dramatic impacts on the issue of climate change, whereas the systemic changes that need to be made are really the more significant ones. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, I think both are important. Both are important. We need to have the policies and the leadership from our governments to facilitate the lifestyle changes that we would all like to make. For example, transit is an enormous source of emissions, and yet many of us need to get around in cars. We don't have access to public transit, but we can't all buy an electric vehicle yet because we don't have the charging stations. We have to have the policies and the infrastructure investment to make those large scale changes possible so that we can make our own lifestyle changes, embodying the virtuous desire to care for creation that we have. At the same time, the individual actions we can take now do make a difference. We can avoid our consumption of meat, of plastic. We can reduce unnecessary flying. There's so much we can do in terms of fair trade purchasing and organic purchasing and advocacy. So I don't think it's an either or. Both actions are really needed, both personal lifestyle changes, because again, meat eating, hugely beef consumption is so complicit in greenhouse gas emissions globally, and anything that contributes to deforestation is truly complicit in the problem. So that personal lifestyle change makes a big difference, even while we must raise our voices and demand the policy changes that will give us more options and that will give us a fossil-free energy infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. So David Ascoma, are you out there? If you can, if you'd unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so you talked about, the immediate action of the radical action that we need to get to carbon neutral by 2050, but will the continued strategy of trying to be nice with conservatives and sort of convince them morally that they need to support climate change, are we going to continue with that strategy? In my opinion, I think it's a failed strategy because we've gotten nowhere, because we haven't really talked about the real issue as to why conservatives or the politicians more than the voters, actually, as you said, that the younger voters have started to accept that climate change is a problem. But I believe you said that some Republicans are taking clean energy platform positions. I don't know of any. I know that they're all the main problem is they're all corrupt, and that's not why we're gonna get.
Okay, you need to get to your question.
Yes. So the question is, are we going to keep playing kumbaya with Republicans, or are we going to have to eventually say, okay, we can't work with you?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. And I think you've put your finger on the stalemate that we've seen in the United States for years. Action has not been taken, and it's because there's been incredible obstructionism at the federal government. Now, great action is taking place at the state and local governments, and that's very important. But we do need federal action, and we do need, as a nation, to support the Paris Accord. So how do we deal with obstructionists in Congress? Well, part of my answer to that is divest and create a moral stigma to fossil fuel consumption, make it socially unacceptable to profit from fossil fuel investments, and make it socially unacceptable and morally stigmatized for politicians to accept fossil fuel money, publicize the way that our Congress people are accepting fossil fuel money, because this is what makes them opposed to progress. So I think that we have to reject the intransigence and the power of fossil fuel money in our governments by calling it out and shedding light on it. And divestment is one way of doing it, and holding a light to who is accepting money from whom is really important.
Thank you. We just have time for one more question. Is Alex out there? Alex, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. First off, thank you so much, Erin. That's a really superb presentation. My question is about, there's a movement in Europe and in South America and other parts of the world that is it calls itself, it's about degrowth. And you utilized a cartoon from the New Yorker pointing out how much kind of capitalist thinking and way of being in the world is destroying the planet. So I'm wondering what you think of that whole movement of degrowth. And don't they have a point that we need to be working on developing a post-capitalist society?
Thank you, Alex, for a great question. There are, many fields of green economics, and I think they all have one thing in common. We have to tread more lightly on this earth and quit accumulating piles of garbage. And a consumeristic mentality is part of the problem, but also is an economic strategy that recommends ongoing production as the measure of success. So we have to, one, think about how our production has to be circular so that whatever is created has an inbuilt plan for recycling at the end of use. That's essential. And to start to think about ways in which prosperity and well-being are the true measures of a society's common good and of an individual's happiness is another very powerful way forward. And there is, in fact, a happiness index out there that measures many factors in societal and family life and individual life. It's far richer and more comprehensive than simple gross domestic product. And I think it's much more spiritual. So these are ways of revisioning our lives in the fullness of our life, not simply along its economic vector.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lothes. We're out of time today, but thank you for your wonderful presentation and keep up your great work. Next week, we're going to have our president, President James Harris of the University of San Diego, will be speaking on the University of San Diego, a Laudato Si University ? As we look about affiliating as a Laudato Si University. So that'll be on Wednesday at 2 p.m. live at the Ministry Center and on Zoom for those of you who can't attend. So thank you to everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Lothes, and everyone have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. So we had seven people live.